All right, so today I'll be talking about understanding crop use and preferences in agro-ecosystems. So I'm Sarah Chinn. I'm a PhD student at the University of Georgia, Savannah River Ecology Lab, and I'm one of the many authors on this paper. So I'd like to specifically recognize Dr. Beasley, Dr. Webb, and Dr. Pepin as the main advisors, as well as Dr. Mark Wilber for being the lead author, as well as being the driving force behind all of the analyses and modeling. So what is the perfect model of an invasive species? So first of all, what is an invasive species? They're species that are non-native to the ecosystem and have the potential to cause harm. So what are some of the characteristics that make this perfect invasive species model? They are adaptive generalists. They usually have a wide distribution. They can grow and reproduce very quickly. And they also tend to damage their habitat. And they're also often difficult to manage. So we really have to look no further for our perfect model invasive species than the wild pig. And wild pigs are also this polarizing figure. So people have very strong opinions about them that kind of go along a spectrum, but also to the extremes. So you've got some people that really like to hunt wild pigs. And so they are the second most popular hunted species in the US behind white-tailed deer. And some states actually have a legal designation for wild pigs as game species. And so this popularity has really contributed to this behavior from people to capture wild pigs in areas and then move them to another area where they may not be very prevalent or may not have yet expanded to. And so this behavior of translocating wild pigs has really affected their spread across the US. So it has contributed to the exponential increase over about the past 30 or so years of wild pigs in the US. And then on the other side, when we look at wild pigs, so they are this perfect model of an invasive species. They can live almost anywhere and pretty much eat anything. So they are really good at what they do. And so wherever they are, they tend to cause some sort of damage or harm. And so they're often considered this destructive pest that costs a lot of money. So especially for folks that work in conservation or land management, they really want these pigs to be removed from the landscape or at least to reduce their numbers. So on one hand, people really like these pigs on the landscape for hunting, and they want to keep them there. And they even want maybe more pigs on the landscape. And then on the other hand, because pigs are so damaging, is that there are folks that want to eradicate them or at least decrease their populations. So wild pigs are ecosystem engineers, meaning they have these profound impacts on their habitats and ecosystems. And so in some ways that they have these impacts are they can be direct in terms of eating whatever is there. So they can eat crops, they can eat native plants and native animals, and even outcompete these native animals. And this is especially a concern when we're thinking about the threatened and endangered species. And they're also, their rooting behavior can also directly affect the habitat. Some indirect consequences can be that when they make these wallows for thermoregulating or scent marking, that they're also damaging the landscape that way. And wild pigs may also rub against trees for scent marking, which can debark that tree and may actually even kill that tree. Agro-ecosystems are a proposed driver of wild pig population spread, establishment, and increase. And wherever wild pigs are, and if they overlap with any crops, there's potential for those pigs to cause damage. And they can do that through eating the crops directly, by rooting, which could damage the soil, the landscape, or the plant. And they may actually even cause damage to machinery that goes around that trying to repair the rooted soils. So crop use is also actually can be dependent on other things, such as what other resources are available to those pigs, as well as individual attributes for those pigs and some environmental factors that we'll get into. The objective of our study was to use movement data to better understand preferences for agricultural and natural forage in context of the consumer and environmental attributes. Understanding context dependencies such as resource availability, wild pig attributes, and environmental factors can better inform the pigs' movement behavior and selection in these crops, which can also lead to improvement in predictions of hotspots for damage, as well as can inform strategies to mitigate damage across these locations with crops at different times and different seasons. We hypothesize that the use of agricultural crops will increase when natural forage is low, that males will select for crops more often and use them for longer compared to females, and that crops will be selected for more often when they are closer to the core part of each individual's home range. We use GPS collar data from 326 wild pigs across the US in 7 different subpopulations. So in California, Texas, Missouri, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. And then we use continuous time functional movement models to standardize the differences in GPS fix rates across all these different studies. Our agricultural data is from the National Agricultural Statistics Services, or NASS. And basically we compiled all the different types of agricultural crops that were used by wild pigs, and then we condensed them into 10 different groups for our study. And we did that based on crop similarities as well as caloric value. And our 10 groups are cereals, fruits and nuts, sugar, oilseeds, beverages and spices, roots and tubers, vegetables and melons, legumes, tobacco, and cotton. And then for each pig, we calculated crop use at the monthly scale. And so we did this by taking the total amount of time that a pig spent in a crop and divided that by the total amount of time that pig was collared. We also calculated the monthly visitation rate by taking the number of visits per month to a crop and dividing that by the total number of months that the pig was collared. For each individual, we also calculated crop availability, and we did that by first taking the total area available to a pig. So essentially taking its whole movement pathway and using a 100% minimum convex polygon. So that was our total area available to that pig using that sort of home range delineation. And then within that 100% MCP, we looked at what crops were available to it and then took the area of those crops and then divided it by that total home range area to get crop availability for each pig in the context of their home range. We also use some agricultural covariates. So we have distance to crop, which was calculated by finding the mean distance from the core home range. So our core home range was the 50% MCP to the center of each available crop field. And we also had crop seasonality, which we determined by the planting and harvesting dates. So essentially when that crop was available on the landscape. We also have non-agricultural covariates. So we use the Enhanced Vegetation Index, or EVI, which is a measure of plant and non-agricultural resource productivity. So we use this as a proxy for the amount of non-agricultural food resources that were available. And then we also have canopy cover adjacent to crops that may act as a refuge for pigs to raid in and out of those crops. So here we have an example. This pig, we've got their entire movement pathway, and then we used a continuous time movement model. We fit that on top of their pathway, smoothed it out so that we could get a location at any time along their collaring duration. And then we put this pathway onto an agricultural layer. So here in red, we have the pig's movement pathway, and then that pathway is bound by the dotted line labeled available. So that's the 100% MCP. And then sort of in the middle of this, we see a smaller polygon outlined in black, and that is the 50% core home range. And then we can see that in the upper corner, this pig had pistachios and grapes available to it. Using the same pig as an example, we calculated the number of crop visits per month, as well as the number of hours spent in that crop per month. So here we see that in October, this pig spent the most, had a peak in the number of crop visits, as well as the time spent per month in October. And we also found that this pig visited pistachios more often and spent more time in that pistachio field compared to grapes. Our pigs had 27 different crops available to them. And then in terms of the dominant crop per state, we had grapes in California, oranges in Florida, rye in Georgia, sugarcane and corn in Louisiana, soybeans in Missouri and South Carolina, and sorghum in Texas. So then for the 122 pigs that had more than one crop available to them, we found that the dominant crop was used proportional to its availability. So there was no difference between the use and availability of the dominant or secondary crop. So in other words, there was no selection for one crop over the other if more than one was available. For the 168 pigs that used crops, we looked at crop use versus availability. So the black dots represent the crop visit per month in a given year. And then the red line is crop use. So in this graph, we can see that as crops became more available, wild pigs used crops exponentially more. So their use exponentially increased as crop availability increased. And then in conditions of high EVI, so remember we're using EVI as a proxy for the natural food that is available to them on the landscape. So in conditions of high EVI, we found that their time in agricultural crops decreased and that crop visitation decreased. So essentially, as natural forage resources increased on the landscape, pigs spent less time in those crops. We also found that as distance increased to crops, that crop use decreased. And that when crops were in season, that crop use increased. We did not find an effect of canopy cover. And then we did find significant variation in individuals. So within all of our wild pigs, there was significant variation. So each individual pig showed different behavior in terms of using crops. And we found that males used crops 20% more than females and visited crops 58% more of the time compared to females. Behavioral responses have important implications for the ability of consumers to exploit resources and to persist in or invade an ecosystem. And invasive wild pigs are increasing throughout the US and the world. And our study shows that these wild pigs have a strong behavioral response with increased availability of crops, predicting an exponential increase in use of those crops. Proximity of an agro-ecosystem to a pig's home range may also increase its selection for being used. And crops that are larger and are available for longer, so crops that have a longer growing season, may also increase that crop's risk of being used by pigs. We also found that pigs selected fruit and nut crops most often. And our study also stresses and highlights the importance of using these context dependencies because they are what are driving pig behavior and selection. It was significantly and predictably context dependent that pigs responded to increased crop availability to a lesser extent when non-agricultural food resources such as mast were available. And male pigs are more likely to cause damage to crops, especially in times of low forage availability, because they use crops more often. Diet studies of wild pigs also suggest that they preferentially forage on non-agricultural resources when they're available, but will switch to feeding on crops when those crops are available or are ripe. Non-agricultural resources may be more consistently available, may be more predictable to pigs, and when you take into the account the distance and the time and energy to travel to crops, as well as crop protection practices. Those things may actually further increase wild pigs' use and selection for natural resources versus maybe that risky behavior of going into a crop. Resource switching, can also be driven by consumer learning. And if they learn how to more efficiently exploit a resource as their encounters increase. And studies also show that pigs can remember locations of profitable resources and will adjust their behavior in order to exploit those resources. The damage invasive species inflict on a resource is directly related to their behavior. The approach that we developed in this study provides a way that we can actually link damage and wild pig behavior, so their movement and their selection, and particularly in these crops. And so by combining commonly collected GPS data and using continuous time movement models, we developed a method that allows us to predict the total amount of time that wild pigs spend in crops, and in the context of crop availability, crop type, individual pig attributes, and environmental factors. The time spent in crops could be a useful proxy for quantifying crop damage by wild pigs or other wildlife. And there's a possibility to retroactively estimate crop damage from where an animal has spent time, and to actually predict crop damage in an area where an animal has yet to establish. And these context dependencies, see if I can get my, see if we can get this to advance again. No. There we go. Okay. And so we may actually be able to, so calculating these crop visitation rates and crop selection will help to manage wild pig populations better. And these context dependencies are important to consider and may lead to predictable patterns that can aid in predicting the impact of wild pigs and other invasive species on resources that are of a management concern. And managers may also be able to actually calculate individual damage rates and use those to predict local landscape damage in accordance to local wild pig abundances if that is known in those areas. And further, deployment of collars with cameras could actually bring insight and validation to crop use and selection by these animals. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge all of our funding sources as well as our associated institutions. And a big thank you to our lead author, Mark Wilber, pictured here, as well as Tyler Campbell, Susan Cooper, Deidre Marietta, Mikey Tabak, and David Wolfson for their contributions to a lot of the covariate data, cleaning up the data, as well as helping out with a lot of the GPS collar data. And with that, my email is listed at the top of the screen here if you have any questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.